believe that science is shaped by society, as I'm sure all of you are, and that science should inform society. Ideally, I think scientific research should inform policy and the decisions that we take. But I think nothing tests this as a principle more than the whole issue of climate change. The science of climate change is complex. There's many uncertainties, and those uncertainties are very difficult to explain to people. It's almost impossible to predict the future accurately, and that's what people want us to be able to do in the field of climate change. All of those factors make climate change difficult to communicate. They leave room for doubt, and where there's room for doubt, that leaves the door open for the climate deniers to come in. However, I think that if we value science, if we trust logic and research, then climate science provides a real driver for policy change, and it should ultimately affect our societies and the way that we live our lives. So what does the climate science tell us? It tells us that there is a build-up of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. It tells us that the world is warming, and that this is going to lead to more frequent extreme events such as floods, droughts, storms and heat waves. We know that this will lead then to water shortages, declining yields and food insecurity for many parts of the world. We also know that extreme events and disasters fueled by climate change are going to lead to loss of life, loss of livelihoods, people being displaced from their homes, and ultimately migration. So we're starting to see for the first time climate refugees as a term which we need to use. But science of climate change also tells us who will be most affected, and this is what we particularly look at in the foundation. The poor and those living in marginal environments, whether that be a small island atoll or a very dry semi-arid plain, are the most exposed to the impacts of climate change. And paradoxically, those are the people who have also contributed least to the problem of climate change. The most vulnerable parts of the world are responsible for an almost insignificant proportion of total greenhouse gas emissions going into the atmosphere. And these underdeveloped, unindustrialized countries have not benefited from the carbon-intensive growth that has allowed us to prosper in the developed world. So although in the developed world we contributed most to the problem of climate change, we're also most protected from its impacts due to our relative wealth, our access to technology, and our scientific know-how. These things can help us to get over the problem, if you like, to an extent. There's an extent to all of this, a limit to all of this, should I say. So while half a metre of sea level rise in Bangladesh means that millions of people will be displaced, livelihoods lost, the same level of sea level rise in the Netherlands will be an engineering challenge. It will be expensive, but they will find a way around it. And it is these inequalities which are present throughout the science of climate change that lead to this whole approach of climate justice. This is what it's these inequalities that climate justice is trying to correct. So climate justice is a new expression. I spend a lot of time explaining it to people. It can be divisive, it can be confrontational. So I want to give you my spin, and I think the Mary Robinson Foundation spin on what it is. Climate justice seeks to protect those who are most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, and who did least to cause it. So this is the victim side of things, if you like. But it also seeks to ensure equal access to the opportunities and benefits arising from our responses to climate change. So in responding to climate change, in reducing emissions, in developing green technologies, there are also opportunities and benefits which all people of the world deserve to access equally. So climate justice incorporates a human rights dimension to climate change, and it focuses on people. It puts people center stage. Mary always says, I want to see people, not polar bears, as the marketing piece, if you like, for climate change. And climate justice is also based on the fact that all people have the right to develop. So whether you're someone living in Dublin or someone living in Malawi, you have the right to continue to grow, to expect a better quality of living, a better standard of life. In this way, a climate justice approach translates into obligations for the international community to act. So we need to do several things. We need to reduce greenhouse gases so that we can avoid dangerous climate change. We need to provide technical and financial support to the countries who are most at risk. And this generally involves a transfer of finance and technology from the developed world to the developing world. And we need to develop climate change responses that are effective, that actually work in terms of helping people to adapt to climate change, but which also reduce greenhouse gas emissions and protect the whole world and the globe, our ecosystems, from dangerous climate change. So I'd like to put this in context with a bit of a real-world example and talk to you about Malawi as an example of a country where I've done a little bit of work. In Malawi, farmers are already feeling the impacts of climate change. It's not something that they think will happen in 50 or 100 years. It's already happening. The growing season has become unpredictable, and what that means is it's difficult to know when to sow your precious seeds that you have saved from last year. and it's difficult to know when to use that very expensive fertilizer that you have spent every bit of available money you have on buying. More frequent flooding is a problem because of changes in the rainfall patterns. We're getting more intensive rainfall patterns, so lots of the same volume of rain but maybe falling in shorter periods of time. And deforestation, these two factors combined are leading to flash floods, which I visited villages there with that had literally wiped out whole fields of crops gone. So that's people's livelihoods ruined for that year and future years. On top of that, you have a country which has been battling with HIV and AIDS for the last 10 years. There are many, many women-headed households. They're already at the limits of their ability to cope. And then comes climate change. It's another factor. And it's one which will, in many cases, just puts people over the edge. It's something which is just one more undeserved burden, I suppose, on people. So, despite this being the bad story, if you like, lots of positive things are happening. Actions are being taken, and responding to climate change is bringing opportunities even to these most vulnerable people. So the government of Malawi has a good thing for a starting point. It has a plan. I hope our government will have a plan. It has a climate change policy, which is enshrined in its National Adaptation Plan of Action. It has a disaster risk management strategy, so it knows what it needs to do to prepare for and minimise risks due to climate-induced disasters. And the donor community in Malawi are working with governments in line with these strategic priorities to help them to implement activities on the ground. So in villages that I visited while I was in Malawi, already communities were acting to adapt. They were planting trees to protect their crops from floods and to reduce erosion of their very valuable fertile soil. They were looking at new crops, experimenting crops which might be drought resistant. And they were looking at new ways of farming, such as conservation agriculture and different types of agroforestry. And they were preparing for disasters. They were mobilising and preparing themselves at the local level so that when a disaster hit, they didn't have to sit and wait and be victims. They knew what they could do to look after themselves. But what's interesting is also the other side of what they're doing, not just protecting themselves as victims of climate change, but looking at embracing and grasping the opportunities that climate change and responding to climate change can offer. So they're tapping into the carbon market. New fuel-efficient stoves are being introduced which reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Now remember, Malawi's greenhouse gas emissions are completely insignificant on the global level, but they can still make reductions. And in making those reductions, they can attract carbon credits and carbon finance into their communities. So these several projects in Malawi which are looking at fuel-efficient stoves, they're really interesting because A, it's the women who make the stoves. So it's a new source of income for the women that are involved in this project. It's cottage industry, you can do it at home when you have the free time. It reduces the amount of time that women spend collecting firewood because they don't need as much firewood. That allows women and girls to engage in other activities, whether that's to generate income, spend time with their kids, go to school, whatever it might be. It reduces demand for firewood, which is having a positive effect on slowing the rate of deforestation, which I already said is one of the key factors contributing to flash flooding. It's improving health, particularly the health of women, because it's reducing the incidence of indoor air pollution. So as the stoves burn less fuel, produce less smoke, it's much healthier. And it's bringing in a new income stream into communities, which communities are free to decide how to use it from carbon finance through the Clean Development Mechanism. So there's opportunities as well as the threat, and I think that's something that we don't talk enough about in climate change. I think that in this way, those most at risk from climate change are accessing the benefits of a low-carbon future. They're being encouraged to invest in a low-carbon future. They see a value of a low-carbon future. I think this is an essential and overlooked aspect of climate justice, where people automatically think we're only talking about victims and adaptation. There is a tendency for developed countries to focus their support, I think, on those countries where you can make big gains in terms of emissions reduction. So up until now, a lot of our investment from developed countries has gone into the larger, admitting more advanced developing countries, be that China, India, Brazil, South Africa, but with less attractive options, I suppose, engaging in investing money in those countries with the tiny, tiny emissions. But I think if we focus on those countries which are emerging, which are going to grow, which have the right to develop, they have the opportunity to leapfrog our fossil fuel dependent economies and to go instead for a kind of a green growth future. And I wanted to draw your attention to some recent research that UNEP conducted into the green economy. And this is really interesting because it's a whole positive spin on sustainable development and climate change. And this big international study, which got launched about 2 weeks ago, found that investing just 2% of global GDP in a couple of key sectors such as agriculture, forestry, fisheries and energy could really rapidly kickstart a transition for many, many countries to a low-carbon future. It found that greening the economy generated high levels of GDP and higher GDP per capita, and that you didn't need to wait 50 years for this to happen. It could happen in 5 to 10 years. That's a very short time horizon. And it also found that a green economy produced lots and lots of green jobs, which could help to take over from the brown jobs, if you like, the industrial jobs that we're losing at the moment. That it contributes positively to poverty alleviation, and that it obviously has positive societal and environmental impacts. So I like this can-do positive attitude to sustainable development and climate change, and I think it's a refreshing change from doom and gloom, which is traditionally associated with kind of environmental movements, and why I never let anybody describe me as an environmentalist. So it just hasn't worked. It's telling people that it's the end of the world, it's the end of the world, it's the end of the world. It really has to change. So I think this is the time now for a positive approach, focusing on opportunities, whilst recognising that some people are more vulnerable than others, but changing the whole conversation that we have about climate change. And changing the way that we as scientists talk about it, the way that we converse with it, because I think then it will start to change society and the way decisions are made. I think this approach could help us to achieve, finally, maybe, an equitable and just international agreement, which looks after the vulnerable but also provides them with opportunities. And it could lead to a more positive approach to climate change in Ireland, where I think climate change at the moment is kind of at an all-time low in terms of public opinion. I think there's a lot of work to be done to get it back up there. Anyway, I'm going to stop there. A few thoughts. I look forward to discussing them more with you. I hope we'll have lots of time for discussion. And thank you.